thank you for being here. First, I want to thank everybody from the Economical Center, from the Planning Center here at Yale for all the help organizing this. We hope this is the first of many. This is like a first step towards collaboration between Yale University and CNE and trying to help Puerto Rico to recover. We all know Puerto Rico has been suffering a series of setbacks in the recent years, and now it's a great opportunity to kind of help Puerto Rico to restart and to go back on its feet. We won't take much of your time, and by the way, Jose Antonio Spinsanchez, I'm a professor here, and we've been organizing this between Yale and the CNE, which is a think tank in Puerto Rico. And without further ado, let me introduce you to Mike Soto, who is the president of CNE, and he's a Yale alumni, and he's going to do the master of ceremonies today.
Gracias, José Antonio, y buenas tardes. It's a privilege for all of us to have you guys here with us today, and we're very appreciative of all the work and help that José Antonio and the rest of the team have done. So thank you very much. Why doesn't Puerto Rico grow? That has been one of the biggest questions that our group and many others have been dealing with for a long time, and as my colleague Deepak Nieves says, it's a puzzle, it's an enigma. We have all the things that we think you would need to grow, and yet Puerto Rico is unable to do that. But we keep asking the question, and we keep pushing, and that was partly what we were doing here since yesterday and all during the morning. We assembled a great team of scholars, half of them from Puerto Rico, half of them from here at Yale, and some from other universities as well. And we discussed this issue, and we're going to keep pushing and trying to find how do we get Puerto Rico to grow. And it was a great exchange. It was very informative. I'm constantly surprised at the new things that we continue to learn, especially when we look at it from the point of view of folks that freshen up and kind of give a new perspective to the work that we're doing. So it was a very great exchange. I wanted to thank, before I forget, first of all, Joe Stiglitz, Professor Stiglitz, who's been a great friend to Puerto Rico for many years now, and we're really appreciative that you came this morning and this afternoon. Martin Guzman, who's also been working with us for a long time and is also a great friend to Puerto Rico. All the speakers that were with us last night, this morning, again, very appreciative, especially those of you that came from far away. I want to thank the folks at the Economic Growth Center, Aishwarya and Rohini, who have helped us put this together. Jose Antonio, as I mentioned, we couldn't have done it without you. I really appreciate all the help and the time that you put into this. Daniel Colon was also a conspirator, really helped us to put this together. The Tobin Center and RITM were also involved, and so I'm very grateful for the work that they put in. And just to finish, I want to kind of let you know why we're doing this here at Yale. Center for a New Economies in Puerto Rico, the issue is Puerto Rico, so why are we doing this here at Yale? And partly it's because, Yale is an incredible global platform and a knowledge center. And you have, there are great minds here that can really help us with the issues that we are challenged by. But mostly, the reason that I thought it was important to do this here is to inspire a new generation. Those of you who are students here, this is something that I think my generation and the generations before us have screwed up pretty big time, on the issue of Puerto Rico. I don't think we've done a very good job of pushing this forward. And so we hope that we're able to inspire some of the fresh, young, new minds that are here to look at this issue and to keep working and to keep trying to get Puerto Rico to get to the next level. So I have great hope and great faith in your generation, and I hope that you guys get inspired by some of the things that you hear here today. So with that, I leave you with Deepak.
Thank you very much, Mike. My name is Deepak Lambanieves. I am the Research Director at the Center for the New Economy and the Churchill G. Carey Jr. Chair in Economic Development Research. So today my job is very simple, but also very important. This is a three-part event, and I want to give you a rundown of the event as well as present our day's speaker. The three-part event consists of, the first part is remarks by Professor Horacio Atanasio and a commentary by Professor Raquel Fernandez. The second part will feature a talk by Professor Joseph Stiglitz and a commentary by Professor Martin Guzman. Then we'll have a moderated conversation and Q&A, moderated by your previous speaker, Miguel Sotoclas, the president of CNE. So come up with questions and we'll try to come up with answers to them. So now let me just briefly introduce Professor Horacio Atanasio and Raquel Fernandez. Horacio Atanasio is the Cowles Professor of Economics at Yale University, a research fellow and one of the directors of the ESRC Center for the Microeconomic Analysis of Public Policy at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. After obtaining a PhD at the London School of Economics, Horacio taught at Stanford University and the University of Bologna. Before joining Yale, he was a Jeremy Bentham Professor of Economics at University College London. Horacio's research interests include household consumption, saving and labor supply behavior, risk sharing, evaluation and design of policies in developing countries, human capital accumulation in developing countries, early year interventions, microcredit, measurement tools, and surveys. He's carried out evaluations of education financing and access programs, including large conditional cash transfer programs, the impact of scholarships on school enrollment, and the effect of subjective expectations on the returns to education. Professor Raquel Fernandez holds a silver professorship in the Department of Economics at NYU. She has previously been a tenured professor at the London School of Economics, Boston University, and Oslo University. She is a fellow of the Econometric Society, the recipient of numerous National Science Foundation grants, of a Spencer Fellowship from the National Academy of Education, and has been a National Fellow at the Hoover Institute and a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. Fernandez has very broad research interests that span sovereign debt, culture and economics, development and gender issues, macroeconomics and inequality, and political economy. She has published extensively in the leading journals. So with that, I'll leave you with Professor Horacio Atanasio.
I will need some help to get my slides. I just move them. All right. Okay. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the, can you hear me on the back? Yeah. Thanks very much for organizing all this event. Personally, I've not been involved in any work with Puerto Rico or in Puerto Rico until now. And over these 2 days, I've learned a huge amount, and I think it's very interesting. I should also mention that, you know, in doing this, wearing my hat as an affiliate of the Economic Growth Center, and as Jose knows, we have been thinking about increasing the involvement that the EGC has in Latin America. And we have a number of initiatives. One thing that we have a small endowment within the EGC, which is dedicated to Carlos Diaz Alejandro, another Caribbean important economist of many years ago, who taught at Yale for a while. What I'm gonna talk today, we have, as was mentioned this morning and yesterday, we had some really interesting discussions about why is Puerto Rico not growing enough, what the situation is there. And one of the things that struck me from these discussions is that many of the presenters were comparing or putting Puerto Rico comparing it to U.S. states, given the proximity to the United States, given the status within the United States, that's only natural. However, I also think that Puerto Rico is part of Latin America. And as such, it would be interesting to use this other background to understand some of the things that go on in Puerto Rico. And partly this is self-serving, but within EGC, I've been involved into this relatively large project. We call it LACIR, which is Latin American and the Caribbean Inequality Review, which does what the title says. It looks at the evolution, the determinants and the evolution of inequality in the region. So what is this? So I'm going to talk about this, and at the end, maybe I'll try to say a few words about why this look at inequality, its determinants and its drivers might and maybe should be relevant for Puerto Rico, reflecting some of the things that we discussed yesterday and today. So what is LACIR? What's the scopes and aims? It's a research effort. It's funded mainly by the IDB, but also by the LSE Inequality Center and the EGC to understand the nature and the recent dynamics of inequality in Latin America, which, we know that Latin America is very unequal, but not everybody agrees on what is the recent evolution, as inequality start to decline or maybe not. It is modeled after the Deaton Inequality Review. Some of us a few years ago approached Angus Deaton to chair a panel to study inequality in the UK, which is where I was working at the time, and in a few other countries. And in the end, what we do, because at the time it was ANSYS LACIR, an interdisciplinary panel, which identified 5 big themes, and I'll come back to that in a second, that we think are relevant for the study of inequality. I do want to stress the inequality part here, because, the interdisciplinary part here, because I think that's something that personally I learned a lot from interacting with other scholars from other disciplines, but I genuinely think that is an important characteristics of these initiatives that allows us to reach the scopes the goals that we have. So the panel over the last couple of years, the LACIR panel, has met a number of times, mainly virtually over Zoom, and discussed the issues around these 5 big themes. By the way, Raquel is an important component of that panel. And we commissioned a number of papers around those 5 themes, 28 papers. These papers have been written by some panel members, but also by other scholars from outside the panel. If you want more information, there's the web page on us here. Oops. We had the first draft of these papers, these 28 papers, at the end of August last year, and this stuff was presented in Washington at the IDB on a very interesting conversation that we had. And then a few weeks ago, we had a meeting in Cartagena. And it was a slightly unusual workshop in the sense that we decided not to listen to the 28 papers again. Instead, we invited a number of people for each of the themes that we had 2 or 3 discussants that took the papers and tried to distill the lessons that we learned from this work and also complement them with additional material and stuff. Was a little bit of a risky adventure, but I think was very successful. I enjoyed my 2 days in Cartagena a lot, and that was very good. The next step for the panel will be to try to distill and synthesize all that we've learned around this in a volume that is going to be targeted not just to academics but also to policymakers. Another person that I should mention is Valentina, who is sitting over there, who has been a postdoc hired here at the EGC with funds from the Carlos Alejandro Diaz endowment. So what are the 5 themes we look at? The first one is to try to set up where we stand. So we want to understand what is the level of inequality and the trends of inequality in Latin America. The second one talks about not just income inequality, but inequality of opportunity. That's the other big theme. And I will give comments on each of these 5 themes in a second. Then we start looking at the drivers of inequality. Where does inequality comes from? And therefore, there are a number of papers that look at the function of labor markets, but also of capital markets and commodity markets, goods markets. And then we look at what governments do. And so we look at taxation and redistribution. Does the government level the playing field in the continent, and does it do it uniformly across different countries? And finally, the last but not least theme is about inequality and political power. So it talks about the structures of political systems in the region and the strugglers and the struggles that we see any day. So let's go back, dig a little bit deeper into the themes. The first, as I mentioned, is the levels and trends of inequality. We all know that Latin America is very unequal. And indeed, this morning when I discussed one of the contributions of today's event, I noticed that Puerto Rico is not the exception there. Has got levels of inequality that are comparable to some of the most unequal countries in the continent. The second point is a little bit more nuanced. Inequality is not just inequality in income, but in a number of other dimensions. So we start with inequality in income and earnings, but also talk about inequality in consumption and in wealth. They're obviously related, but you can learn different lessons from looking at inequality. Another thing that we've been stressing very strongly is that in many contexts, and especially over the last couple of decades, when looking at the trends in inequality, looking at just the summary measures like the Gini coefficient is not enough, and because it does not reflect a number of phenomena that have been going on extensively across the region and also in other parts of the world. And then we move on to other dimensions. An important thing to consider, for instance, the relationship between income and earnings inequality and health inequality. The epidemiological study of and the evolutions of that in recent years can be very important. And then there is the study of opportunities and human capital inequality that are important, in particular when you start thinking about social mobility and how inequality is transmitted from generation to the next generation. The inequality and opportunities is also particularly salient because of the ethics. If you think a little bit about the ethics of inequality, you know, some might think that inequality is not necessarily a bad thing if inequality reflects inequality in effort or in commitment or in drive. But when you talk about the inequality of opportunities, then the ethics takes a completely different aspect. You don't choose your parents, you don't choose where you're born, you don't choose when you're born, if you're born in the middle of the crisis or not. And therefore, maybe government should do something to level the playing field or to give the same opportunities to different individuals. There is inequality in a bunch of other dimensions, gender, ethnicity, spatial inequality, rural versus urban, and the like. And last, but again not least, inequality in political voice. And the role or the different role that over time communities have played. The last point is one of my little obsessions. Growing old, I've been becoming more and more obsessive on little things. And communities is actually not a little thing, but I think it's very, very important because if you think of, again, going to the ethics and to what we mean by bad inequality, that's the inequality that is partly driven by a sense of exclusion from a society, from an economy, and is related to the dignity of work, the importance of the dignity of work. And in this respect, both in Western countries and in developing countries, the role of communities have been changing quite dramatically. They've become, in a way, more homogeneous, but also much more segregated and much less effective. And so that's I think, an important aspect. And the same is true for Latin America. I would be very curious to learn more about Puerto Rico. So all this Latin America, I've been talking of the region using the singular. However, Latin America is not homogeneous. There are huge differences across countries, and the recent experiences have been very different. And again, recent trends have been mixed. There was the perceived decline in inequality in the early 2000s, but in many countries we're seeing a reversal of that. Moving to the inequality of opportunity, I know Raquel is going to talk about education system, so I won't spend much time, except to say that social mobility in the continent is quite low. And moreover, inequality starts very early in human development. So we see remarkable differences in the cognitive development, the social-emotional development of children by the age of 3 or even before that. And once those differences are started, once you see 6 or 12 months difference in developmental age between the top and bottom quartiles of the income distribution, those differences stay on for a long time. Family structures play an important role in this, and there have been substantial and dramatic changes in family structure. Education systems do not always help us. We'll hear from Raquel. And again, there are big differences between different countries. In one of the studies that we have done, we have seen that countries that are more unequal in terms of, say, income, they're also more unequal in terms of opportunities. If you look at, say, compare Colombia and Uruguay, Colombia is one of the most unequal, Uruguay one of the least unequal in the continent. And that's true at the level of income, but it's also true at the level of, say, cognitive development of young children. The drivers of inequality in markets. As I mentioned, these are a series of papers that look at the labor, capital, and goods markets. A big issue that has been briefly mentioned this morning, but I think is of fundamental importance, is the role that the informal sector plays in the continent. There are countries where 60 or 70 in the region where 60 or 70% of the labor force is informal. And even in countries that are more advanced in this dimension, like Chile, the proportion is around 30%. The phenomenon is very complex and very pervasive. And when I mean complex, it's now workers and firms do not belong permanently to a status. They are not always formal or always informal. You can go to, you find firms that have some workers that are formal, some that are informal. There are workers that go in and out of the formal labor market and to the informal one. So it's a very complicated phenomenon and very important. Some of the panel members, I have to mention Santiago Levy, thinks that especially in countries like Mexico, this is a big obstacle to growth and to productivity growth. There is a large prevalence of small, typically low productivity firms, and there is a very large turnover of firms in the production market. There are in many sectors and in many countries substantial market power and rents that are extracted by firms. And there is an important role of international trade. I see that I have 2 minutes left, so let me talk about the last two themes quickly. Taxation and redistribution. One thing that amazes me is that how different are the roles played by different governments in the region. If comparing Colombia and Chile, in Chile, the government does a fair amount of the redistribution. In Colombia, almost none. And that I found that, especially given that Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the region, I found that pretty amazing. And to assess the role that one lesson that we've been learning is Nora Lustig has been working extensively on this, is that to assess the redistributive role that the governments play, it's important to look not just at taxation, but also at the expenditure side. How much government spent on education, health, social insurance. The conditional cash transfer programs in countries like Mexico or Brazil played a big role in at least in reducing extreme poverty. So looking at the bottom tail. Health systems and pension systems are very heterogeneous across the countries, and in some countries they can accentuate inequalities in a very dramatic fashion. Not only they do this perverse role, but they're also very, very inefficient. Again, unfortunately, Colombia is a good. Colombia is one of the countries I know the best because I've been doing quite a bit of work there. It's not that I want to cite that, but there the pension system is amazingly inefficient. Finally, about political power. We have lived in recent years with lots of conflicts in the regions. There have been, from Chile to Colombia to other places, big protests, and there's been an alternation of right and left-wing parties. But I think they have lost. We have lost the connotation of right versus left. The role of populism into this has been important, and we think that the distribution of political power shapes in an important fashion the economic decision making. This is what we learned so far. Over the last year. I think we are starting to paint a map that points to large differences among the different countries. We found the organization by these 5 big themes extremely useful in organizing our thinking about this. However, we are also identifying bridges between the different themes. And finally, the economics is definitely important. I will not talk against our profession, but it's definitely not the only driver of what's happening. Political dynamics are important, role that social norms and social interactions, and maybe Raquel will refer some to it, health and epidemiology, the process of skill formation. Let me leave you with these slides, just saying that they would be nice and interesting to think how where Puerto Rico plays itself in this Latin American map in all the dimensions and in the 5 themes that I try to describe. Thank you very much, and sorry for running over a few minutes.
Okay, first, it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been here for a while, and I've been to Puerto Rico a few times in my life, but not many, and I would love to go again. That's not a hint, but take it as you will. And I really learned a lot about Puerto Rico this morning, and so I want to thank everybody who contributed to that. Okay, so as Horacio mentioned, I'm along with him, part of the LACIR review of inequality in Latin America, and I was given the rather unenviable task of talking about education inequality and gender inequality in 10 minutes, because after all, this is a small topic. So I'm just not going to tell you very much about either one of them. I'm going to tell you what we did in each of these chapters, giving you just kind of an overview, and then just give you a few pictures so that you go away with some concrete ideas of how at least these aspects look for Latin America and Caribbean, for the countries that we had data for. And you can think about placing Puerto Rico in these characteristics, in these dimensions. So what we were very interested in is not just looking at how much education inequality there was in Latin America, but especially tying that inequality to other things, such as parental education. Why parental education rather than parental income? Because we have good measures in our data sets of parental education. We don't have measures of parental income when we're looking at kids. So we look at things like sheer quantity, how many years of education, what type of degrees do you get, how that matters, how family background matters for that. The quality of education, PISA, which is an international test that kids take at the age of 15 from a representative sample of many, many countries. How well do they do in math and reading? How much do private versus public schools matter across different countries for the quality of education you get as reflected in PISA scores for your years and degrees? How segregated schools are, and here I'm talking mostly about segregation in terms of measures of family background rather than, say, ethnicity or race. And what are the returns to education? How big is, say, the premium for going to college? We also look at inequality, again, relating to all these things, but looking at urban-rural dimensions, which in some of these countries is really important, in some other countries far less so. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot. So I'm going to assume that you're not all economists, although of course you should all be. And I just want to tell you what we're doing here. Here we're looking at different cohorts. So for any country, the bar to your left looks at 25 to 34-year-olds, how much education they receive. And as you go towards the right over here, you're seeing older and older cohorts. And so as you can see in all of these countries in Latin America, average years of education has increased. So this is not a measure of inequality, just a measure of how, what progress we've seen in education. Some countries still, on average, there's very little education, and the growth, although it's there, has not been as large, say, as in countries like Chile. Okay, so that's one snapshot. Another snapshot I wanted to show you was how much your parents' education matters to an outcome such as a tertiary degree, going to college, okay, and graduating from college. So let me just start on the right-hand side to give you some examples. Here are some comparator countries. The US, Korea, Spain, and Turkey. And what this is showing you is that the BC, the baseline case, is if neither of your parents went to secondary school, upper secondary school, the probability that your kid goes to secondary school in the US is 25%. So on average, 25% of those kids go. Well, what if at least one of your parents had a bachelor's degree? Well, then it goes from 25 to 45, so it's 25 plus 20. And what if at least one of your parents had attended college? Well, then it goes to 25 plus 50, 75% of those kids end up going and getting a college degree. That's for the US. Let's look at Latin, and the situation is very different in our comparator countries. Family background always matters, okay, in all of these countries. In some countries, it matters a lot more than others, and in some countries, this base, which is in the United States, 25% of kids, in some cases, like in Colombia, which Horacio was pointing out, is extremely low. This means that if neither of your parents went and had a secondary, graduated from secondary school, the probability that your kid goes on to college is 7%. Whereas if one of them had a tertiary degree, I think that number is 60, sorry, I can't see, 60, so it would be 67%. So there's large inequalities. How much those inequalities matter differs across countries. And Latin America, on the whole, tends to be unequal, but not necessarily always more unequal than a country like the US. But as I said, if you really want to think about the impact, you want to think about the impact of the base plus these different probabilities. Okay. Let me show you another thing having to do with education. These are, when you go and you're 15 years old, you can take one of these PISA tests. As I said, they're nationally representative, and this is showing you their math scores by parental education. So I see that I'm already running out of time. I'm going to start it with gender. I just want to tell you two important things. One important thing is when you look at their comparative countries relative to Latin American countries, Latin American countries get very low PISA scores. It's amazing. To me, this was a surprise. I always thought as Latin Americans, I went to high school in Argentina, as getting a good education. Well, actually, we do terribly. I mean, none of these baseline cases lies above, none of them goes above 400. For the comparator countries, all of them is above 400. These are scores that have a mean of 500 across all the countries and a standard deviation of 100. So these are the marginal effects, again, by parental education. And you can see that even for countries that are very equal, where a lot of people go to college, if you have educated parents in Korea, it makes a very large difference to your scores. Even though a lot of them end up going to college, it still makes a very large difference to your scores. Whereas other countries, and this was a surprise to me again, like the Dominican Republic, your scores are low, but it really doesn't matter very much what type of education your parents had. So now I'm going to switch topics on you completely, since I was asked to do two. And I'll talk a little bit about gender inequality in Latin America. So for gender inequality, we look at gender inequality in education. So everything that I just talked about, we do it again, but we do it again looking at gender gaps, okay? Then we look also as well as gender gaps in the areas of study and occupations when people go to work. So for example, proportions of male versus females in STEM fields. Then by education, so by education of the woman and of the man, we look at their labor force participation. We look at the gender gap in the labor force participation, both at the intensive margin, meaning how many hours they work, and the extensive margin, that is what fraction of women are in the labor force as compared to what fraction of men are in the labor force, looking at men and women with similar levels of education. We look at how hours worked outside the market differ among the sexes. Hours outside the market means working at home, taking care of kids, who does the cooking, who does the cleaning, who does the shopping. We look at what type of work you do. Are you an employee, employers, self-employed, and unpaid workers, like if you're working in a family business. Informality, which as Horacio said, is really important for many Latin American countries. That's where you find a large gender gap as well, many more women in the informal sector. And also, it matters a lot if you're employed in a large firm versus a small firm. We look at the gender gap in that. We look at gender gap in wages. Let me skip this. And we look at what happens to things like earnings for employment or hours worked once you have a child. And we compare that for men versus women. So I have only 2 minutes. So I am going to show you just some little facts. These are gender gaps in those math PISA scores I talked to you about before. These are average female minus average male scores in math. The fact that they're negative everywhere is telling you that men are doing better than women. How should I read a number like -20? It means that 20% of one standard deviation women do worse by 1 standard deviation on average in Columbia in math relative to their male counterparts. Now, are these numbers large? Well, across the OECD, it's 5. These numbers, luckily, well, not luckily, but showing progress, have been getting smaller. So we can compare it at 2 moments of time. And this gender gap, the amount by which men do better than women at the age of 15 in math, has been decreasing. And that's generally true in most countries. Oops. You can also look at the gender gap in reading, in PISA scores in reading. This is also true, basically in almost all countries. Women do much better than men. And significantly better than men, the gap is larger between women and men in reading than it is in math. That is, both of these gaps are shrinking, but the math gap has shrunk much more than the one in reading. So if you look at advanced economies, such as OECD economies, actually you have a 30 points gap. And this is how much it differs across countries. And as you see, there's a lot of variation. In some countries, like, again, the Dominican Republic, to me, I'd like to understand what's going on there. It's really large, meaning women are really doing much better than men. And in other countries, and these countries tend to do badly for any gender things, like Colombia, again, does pretty badly for any gender-related topic, it's only 10 points of advantage that women have. Yes, 1 more minute on labor force participation. So I wanted to show you labor force participation. I could easily graph here men. It got a little bit crowded, so I decided not to show that. But here I have labor force participation. Let's start with the US, it's easier. By education. So this is showing you that if you have a college degree, between 2000 and 2020, some 80% of women are in the labor force. And what this is showing you is that women who have only a high school diploma work significantly less. But the people who really, really are not participating very much in the labor market are women who do not have a high school diploma in the United States, okay? It's close to about 50%. If we compare this with Latin America, and let's just skip these 3 lines, just think of it as education right now. It's really divided into high income, middle income, and lower income Latin American countries, but we don't have time for that. You can see that there's not that much difference among highly educated women. You've seen an increase over time, a bit, in terms of women with high school degrees. But where you really see the difference is in the labor force participation of women without high school degrees. And that has been increasing over time, unlike the United States, which has basically stayed flat or gone down. Again, I have no idea what the facts here are for Puerto Rico. These are facts that I would want to know if I wanted to understand how the Puerto Rican labor market looks and what the opportunities are for the future. And then lastly, another way to look at labor force participation is to look at labor force participation over the life cycle. So what I've drawn for you here is, these are the labor force participation of women who were born between 1930 and 1939. And as you go up, each one is born a decade later. So when you get to the top one, these are women who are born between 1980 and 89. So that's why we only have a few data points for them. In a country like Argentina, you see continuous increases in labor force participation. In a country in Mexico, you see very little increase, and furthermore, it's kind of stagnated at a very low level. 40% of women are in the labor force on average, as opposed to, say, 70% in Argentina. How does this compare to other countries that you might be interested in? US has stagnated at a relatively high level, but it's stagnant. 70%. This is not the way it has to be. How do we know that? Well, we can look at France, for example. That's at 90%. You can look at Spain, gigantic growth in female labor force participation. It's at over 90%. Or you can look at another stagnant kind of economy, such as the Indonesian one. Okay, last promise word is the motherhood effect and how it affects labor force participation. So some of you are used to seeing these child penalty so-called graphs. A lot of you are not, I'm assuming. This dashed line over here shows you for these countries, for women from these countries, and for men from these countries, the year, call it year zero, when they had a child. This is not showing you that they were participating at the same amount. It's just showing you whatever they were participating in 3 years before, that didn't change over time. This is the dark one is men. Their labor force participation in Argentina actually goes up. Women's labor force participation falls by some 20 percentage points, and it stays low for the next 5 years that we have data for. So very important, and it differs across countries. One interesting thing, Horacio, about Colombia is actually there's some recovery, which is almost the only country in which I've seen a recovery in labor force participation by women. Okay, I'm going to end there. I think that these are important things to understand in the Puerto Rican context, not just the macro parts. I love macro, but I think very important to understand what's going on with women, what's going on with men, and what's going on with education and intergenerational mobility as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Raquel and Horacio. Lots and lots. So think about lots of topics for us for a research agenda moving forward for Puerto Rico. Now I'd like to move on to the second part of our event. And so we have Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Joseph Stiglitz is an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Professor Stiglitz was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. He is a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and former chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. In 2000, Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University and a partner of CNE. In 2011, he was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information, his research focuses on income distribution, climate change, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. He is the author of numerous books, including, most recently, People, Power, and Profits, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. I'll also introduce Martín Guzmán. Martín Guzmán served as Minister of Economy of the Republic of Argentina from December 2019 until July 2022. He's a leading global expert in the fields of sovereign debt and debt crises resolution. His research focuses on the emergence, propagation, and resolution of macroeconomic disequilibria, monetary economics, and economic development. He is a William S. Beinecke Visiting Professor of Public Policy in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, also a Professor of Money, Credit, and Banking at National University of La Plata, Argentina. Also co-presiding the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, an academic center at Columbia University established by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. He holds a PhD in economics from Brown University, and prior to his doctoral studies, he received a BA in economics and an MA in economics from the National University of La Plata, Argentina. Professor Stiglitz, thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. That building over there is where I spent a lot of time when I was much younger, and many of the papers for which I got the Nobel Prize were written in that building. So it is a pleasure to be here. It's also important. I'm glad to be here to talk about Puerto Rico. It presents a lot of intellectually interesting problems. It was partly the debt crisis that drew me into working on Puerto Rico. I've been working on debt crises since the '97 East Asia crisis and then the Euro crisis and the financial crisis of 2008. And here was another one that was very near to our shores. And I think as Americans, we have a particular responsibility of thinking about and doing what we can for Puerto Rico, because as the title of the talk mentions, of our colonial relationship with Puerto Rico, where for 125 years it has been our largest colony. And I think in many ways we have not done well by Puerto Rico, and I hope we do better going forward. I should probably begin by, I'm not going to present the data of what's happened to Puerto Rico. I assume most of you know that the GDP, the subject of our conference was on growth, but the striking thing about Puerto Rico is it's one of the few places where there's been negative growth. So the challenge here of getting growth is even greater. It's not like a place where the growth has been slow. It's where there's been GDP has been going down, partly because of a large loss of population. I should probably also mention that any approach to this problem that is meaningful has to differ from the standard neoliberal precepts that have dominated economic thinking over the last 40 years. There's a very simple answer under the standard neoliberal approach to the problem. The standard neoliberal approach is that it makes much more sense to move people to the jobs rather than jobs to the people. And so the answer to what to do about Puerto Rico is to have everybody migrate. And that the creditors wouldn't like that because they obviously wouldn't get repaid, but that is obviously a solution that most Puerto Ricans would not think acceptable. And it's actually very similar to my critique of what went on in the Euro crisis. In many ways, the standard model, neoliberal model that dominated economic policy in the Euro area when Greece had a crisis, the standard recipe was for all the Greeks to leave Greece. And Greece was not very happy about that particular idea. You don't have to have all the leave, but you have enough to get GDP per capita up. So we're going to reject that kind of approach and ask what can be done to promote economic growth in a particular place. And this is really a question that's very analogous to that which is being a center of attention in many places in the United States, because many places in the United States have faced deindustrialization, have faced negative growth. They're not they're states, but they're not an island in a potential country, but they've been facing the same problem. And the consequences politically of our not being able to figure out how to get growth in these places in the Midwest and the South, places where there are large inequalities with respect to the average in the United States, the political consequences have been very serious. So I think there's a general widespread recognition that economic policy, social policy, has to address the question of location. And that has become more and more the center of attention in economics. I'm going to divide my talk into two parts. I'm going to first spend a few minutes talking about the general principles and some of the general challenges if you just ask somebody, how do you promote growth? You have a whole growth center across the street, and that you just go over there and ask them how you promote growth, and they'll tell you the answer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the general question, and then I'm going to focus more narrowly on Puerto Rico. The answer that you might have gotten if you had asked the question a few years ago is to look at those parts of the world that have been most successful in economic growth. You look across countries and see what you can infer. I should comment for a few of you who are into randomized control, you can't do this kind of analysis in randomized control. You can't go to a few countries and say, here we're going to try this strategy and another group will try this strategy. People don't like to be experimented on, and you can't do experiments at the national level. We don't have enough countries. So you have to, figuring out what to do has to be based on inference and building up models of how the economy works and looking at experiences. So the most successful countries in the world in their development strategy have been those in East Asia. And it hadn't always been that way. In the late 60s, Gunnar Myrdal, who was one of the first recipients of the Nobel Prize, wrote that Asia would be mired in poverty for centuries going forward, just as it had been in the past. He said there's no way getting out of it. And important lesson for those of you who are going to be economists is never make predictions that are going to be falsified so quickly. At least make them as two-handed, unless something happens, and then when so you have to certain qualify, and you'll see I do that all throughout this talk. But they were, the countries in East Asia were enormously successful, and almost all of them were. And part of why they were is Japan was the first successful one, and the others imitated what it did. But they didn't just imitate, they imitated and adapted. So there was very much of a learning process. And at the center of that was export-led manufacturing growth. And the problem going forward for Puerto Rico and for countries in Africa, countries that are behind, is that that particular development model can't be at the center of their development strategy. You can't rely on it. And the reason is that we've been so successful in developing technology in manufacturing that it is a decreasingly small fraction of global output in employment. Total global employment in manufacturing is something like maybe 15%. And not everybody can be in that 15% engaged in manufacturing. So even if all the jobs, for instance, in manufacturing in China were to move to Africa, it would be just a small percentage of the new entrants into the labor force over the next 50 years. So a manufacturing export-led growth is not going to work. So one is going to have to find an alternative strategy. In thinking about that alternative strategy, what one has to do is to deconstruct why it was that manufacturing export-led growth was so successful. What were the things that it did that led to that high rate of economic growth and a fairly inclusive economic growth, where inequality measures were much lower than those that were presented for Latin America, and remained low. The one country where inequality has become very large is China, But even China has moved 800 million people out of poverty, and that speaks to the point that was made, not looking just at Gini. The Gini is bad for China, but they did pay a lot of attention to the bottom, and they moved 800 million people out of poverty. Well, I can't go through, give a, all of what East Asia did, but I want to emphasize one thing that I think was very important, and that is the important role of technology and learning. At the center of many of their many of their policies was creating a learning society. So they had egalitarian education. They made a very big effort to make sure that everybody had access to education. They had an active industrial policy where they asked the question, focused not on their static comparative advantage, but on their dynamic comparative advantage. At the beginning of Korea's, you saw some of the remarkable charts there on education on Korea that were presented. But at the beginning of Korea's development strategy, the average level of education was a little like 4.3 years. They did not have a comparative advantage in high education sectors. The World Bank, they went to the World Bank and they asked, what should we do? And the World Bank gave the standard answer, you should be rice farmers. That's your comparative advantage. And Korea basically said, thank you, but no thank you, and ignored them. And their view was that even if they were successful rice farmers, they would not have made the developmental transformation, and they would not have been part of a modern economy. So as we think about creating dynamic comparative advantage, that's not easy figuring out, and there were many questions about whether they had made the right decisions at very critical points. They went into CHIPS early. I guess we're coming in about 40 years afterwards with our CHIPS Act, but we learned from Korea that you need to produce chips in a modern economy. But they made other decisions that other people have questioned. So there is a difficult issue of identifying, you might call, levering some natural comparative advantages. Puerto Rico has some natural advantages in sun, its location near the United States, and leveraging them and figuring out how to shape one's own comparative advantage. I'll come back a little bit to this later. Then come the policies that you need to implement the strategy of creating a learning society. And it has to be comprehensive and include lots of things that we've already talked about. They had a lot of focus on education, and what you saw beginning with 4.3 average years in Korea. You saw the numbers that they had today, where they are towards the top in the world. They paid a lot of attention to opportunity, and they gave educational opportunity to everybody. They paid a lot of attention to infrastructure, and they paid considerable attention to try to lowering a variety of kinds of information barriers. I have a natural interest in information as a friction in economic performance, and they were very, very concerned about creating information within their economy, bringing knowledge to their economy, thinking about information barriers that impair the efficiency of their economy, and they created institutional structures to deal with that. One aspect that was very important is they realized that one has to learn. Institutions don't come out of nowhere, and they have to be created and learn to function. So particularly what I have in mind is if you had looked at, and even today, if you look at the government institutions in Korea, they have some, you might say, problems of corruption. The number of presidents that have wound up in jail is not insignificant, but they do it in a way in which it's not, it's actually good for the rule of law. They understand that if you take bribes, you wind up in jail, and then you have people prove that they took bribes. I don't understand why they continue to do it, but and they do it probably less frequently than they used to. But you don't create institutions that work out of just reading it in a textbook. The only way you create strong, good institutions is by doing it and by criticizing it and figuring out what you do wrong. That's relevant for one of the criticisms of industrial policies in many countries is that they didn't work very well. There was corruption and they picked the wrong industries. But in other countries, they've worked very well. In the United States, actually, we've had an industrial policy. It's hidden in the Defense Department, so nobody uses the word industrial policy, but it's defense policy. But it's been one of the reasons for America's technological success. We've learned from our failures, but on average, our return for public investments in R&D and technology have been higher than in any other areas of investment in the private or the public sector. So we've done it very successfully. But when you make mistakes, you don't disband the institutions. You try to learn about where you made your mistakes and do better. So the example I always give is the Federal Reserve keeps making mistakes, but nobody says that after the 2008 crisis, we should get rid of the Federal Reserve. I mean, after all, it's such a failure. Well, it is such a failure, but the lesson was that we ought to make it work better. We didn't quite succeed. We made the wrong appointments, and we had a failure very much like we had in 2008 in regulatory failure. And maybe next time we'll learn a little bit. But it's a process of learning. And what I want to say is you don't abandon institutions. You see if they can work in other places. You figure out what are the checks and balances that you impose to make them work. What are the institutional structures that make them work? And you try to see if they will work in your context. But as one thinks about learning, there are you really need to design learning into all the institutions and programs. And we had an interesting talk this morning on how introducing learning into some of the educational programs. But a lot of the neoliberal policies actually prevented some of that kind of process of learning. So what I have in mind is that the only way that countries are going to, why did Korea learn how to be an industrial manufacturing center? It put trade barriers. It didn't read about how to produce steel in a textbook. It put barriers to trade that got a steel mill to move into Korea. And then it learned very quickly how to produce steel better than the countries from which they were getting the ideas from. So they innovated, but they got the knowledge. And if I have time, I'll talk about some of the instances where current policies being imposed on Puerto Rico, or which Puerto Rico is adopting, are actually undermining the ability to develop that state capacity to do industrial policy or to do other aspects of managing a growth strategy. So let me turn very quickly to Puerto Rico and begin with, in a sense, just a brief mention of the history of the current problems, which were in the 90s. Before that, a particular tax subsidy played a very important role in Puerto Rico's growth, as did the free trade arrangement with the United States, which gave Puerto Rico, as a relatively low-wage economy, an advantage. And then you might say three things happened. One, that tax advantage was repealed. In fact, it happened in 1996, and there were a 10-year period, 95. The second thing was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, gave access to Mexico, which had lower wages than Puerto Rico, because it didn't have the minimum wage that Puerto Rico has the same minimum wage that the United States has. So Mexico had two advantages. It had a flexible exchange rate, and it had low wages. And so it was an alternative sourcing of cheap labor on the border. And the third thing, of course, was the wages in the United States at the bottom got lower and lower in real terms. The real wages in the United States are at the same way, at the bottom, are at the same level now as they were about 60 years ago. So they haven't increased in 60 years, which means that real wages, America has become a low real wage economy. And making it even worse is that there's been a lot of illegal immigration, so the actual real wage to the bottom in the United States is lower. There are more illegal immigrants in the United States. So actually, U.S. is a cheap labor economy compared to Puerto Rico at the bottom. So that really obviously interferes with the economics of Puerto Rico. So as one thinks about the advantages, underlying basic advantages and disadvantages of Puerto Rico, one obvious one is the sun advantage, but the other one is relationship to the United States. And the advantages are the nearness, which is important for not only transportation costs, but also information, but also a level of assistance that it gets, like in the disaster and benefits that it gets. So those are some of the aspects that are the advantages, but there are some very marked disadvantages of being in the economic relationship as a colony. The first is, or at least one is the fixed exchange rate, which takes away the scope for independent scope of policy space of having a monetary policy. Second is the Jones Act, which imposes very high transportation costs and makes energy prices higher and lowers the competitivity of Puerto Rico. And the third is that the regulatory structure is, in many areas, are imposed by the United States without attention to the particular circumstances of Puerto Rico. They apply everywhere, and so they are not adapted to the situation in Puerto Rico. In that sense, in a very broad sense, what being part of the United States, being a colony in the United States, takes away the scope for policy. And the particular aspect of that scope for policy I want to talk about for a few minutes has to do with bankruptcy law. which normally doesn't get a lot of attention. Puerto Rico had a bankruptcy law, and that bankruptcy law would have governed the situation that Puerto Rico found itself in a few years ago, where it couldn't pay its creditors. And it had a law that would govern how that would be handled. And that's what would happen in the case of any sovereign. It's not a very good system, or Martin refers to it as a non-system, but there is a particular way that that's handled or not handled. So Puerto Rico had a law that would govern how that would be handled going forward. But the United States said, because you're a colony, you can't have a bankruptcy law. And at the same time, they said, well, earlier they had said that the bankruptcy law that applies to other public jurisdictions, like cities, like public authorities, like electric power authorities, does not apply to Puerto Rico. And no one's really sure about why Puerto Rico was carved out from Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code of the United States. It happened, and it's one of those mysterious things in policy, and I find it one of the really interesting things. Obviously, somebody went to the trouble of carving out Puerto Rico. It doesn't happen just the ink disappears. It didn't happen. Somebody went to the trouble of doing it, and then they left no traces as far as anybody has been able, and people have tried to figure out who did it. And obviously somebody had an interest in this, but we don't know quite who did. Maybe some of you know who done it. So, but it's had, as many you know, the U.S. government then imposed a control board to work out what happened, which control board both defined how the bankruptcy was, which creditors were going to get paid, but also what policies. So it was really dictating policies. There were other, you shouldn't feel alone in the 1930s when Newfoundland couldn't pay what it was owed. They actually took away all of their democracy and put the whole province into receivership. And they just shut down the government and put 6 bankers to run it. So this is a little better than the way the UK treated Newfoundland, but that shouldn't make you feel very good. So there are many aspects of that, what has happened, and that unfortunately makes growth going forward more difficult, and I just want to outline them. The first was it wasn't a deep enough restructuring. And this is a problem that Martin and I have written about, too little, too late. If it's not deep enough, you still have to pay too much, and the burden stops your economic growth. You're sending all your resources abroad to pay your creditors. You don't have enough resources to invest to make your economy grow. And that's a situation that Puerto Rico was in. And because they have not done a deep enough restructuring, it's a problem that's going to hang over you going forward. One of the reasons for not being deep enough was, of course, the politics. The creditors were very influential. But from an analytic point of view, how many minutes do I have? Deepak?
You got like 12 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. The framework that is used is called a debt sustainability analysis. They're supposed to figure out policies that grow the economy and a deep enough restructuring that you can pay the debt going forward. And that's called a debt sustainability analysis. And analytically, it was very flawed. And so the numbers they use making up for what the growth will be constantly are excessively optimistic. The policies they think are excessively are going to have positive effects or not negative effects in the way that they will. The second aspect, and including the policies, I think they haven't fully taken into account the effects of what they're doing on migration, as an example, and how that will undermine economic growth. On the policy front, the biggest failure is they, like most IMF programs, impose austerity. Their solution to paying back the creditor is don't spend as much money on your own country and spend more, give more money, write a bigger check to Wall Street. Very simple. Now it's actually Connecticut, because a lot of them are owned by the hedge funds in Connecticut, so they go just to your neighbors. It's a very, very simple prescription, but the problem is that when you start looking at what they're cutting the things that would lead to economic growth. And one of the areas, the biggest cutting is education and the University of Puerto Rico. And so if you think about where is growth going to come in the 21st century, it's going to come from highly educated people, engineers that graduate from the University of Puerto Rico, and you have to have, and if you're going to reduce inequality, and having a high level of equality was actually a very important part of East Asia's success. If you're going to, you have to have equality, educational opportunity for everybody, and that means you have to have low tuition at the universities. So the austerity, the imposition of austerity is a policy which is actually going to lower economic growth rather than promote economic growth. What's striking about their program is they don't really have any positive growth agenda. You know, you might have thought that they would think about what the question that we are discussing in the seminar. You would have thought that would have been at the center. What is the growth agenda for Puerto Rico? That's where they should have begun. But really where they began by saying is, how can we cut spending in ways that we can send a bigger check to Wall Street and make up some numbers on economic growth through some structural reforms that I think are not going to be likely to be very successful. So the third thing that aspect where I think that PROMESA, the board, has made a very big mistake is an energy policy. In the restructuring process, there are different parts of the indebtedness, and the energy company, PREPA, is a separate part of it. And it represented a particular problem because if it were a freestanding, ordinary company, you know, a private company, it probably would have been declared doubly bankrupt, and the equity owners would have been wiped out, and the debt would have been wiped out 95%. And that's especially true because in Puerto Rico, the company is a fossil fuel company. Energy is produced mostly by fossil fuel. And we call those assets stranded assets. They're assets that are going to be worth nothing in a few years. Puerto Rico's made a commitment to going to all renewables by 2050, and that, I mean, this is a problem other places in the United States will face, but that means all the fossil fuel assets in 2050 will be worth zero, and that means that they're worth zero in 2050, they're going to be worth zero in 2049 as well. And going back in time, they're not going to be worth very much today. So the basic value of the company is close to zero. And so the bonds ought to be written off close to zero. And that's clearly the right economic answer. And you write them off and you say, you know, I'm sorry that you invested in fossil fuel. You've known since 1992 at least that this was coming, so it's your fault. I don't feel any compassion for you. And you should have been working for green transition a long time earlier. That's not what PREPA is doing. They are having a much smaller write-down and proposing that the bondholders be paid by a charge on the users of electricity. What will that do? That will increase the price of electricity. What you should do is have a fresh start. That's what bankruptcy is all about, a fresh start. And that's why we have the bankruptcy laws. You have a fresh start. You have renewable energy. You may have to have a cushion for a while because wind and sun, they're more reliable than Putin, but they're still not fully reliable, so you still need some buffer. But the cost is basically maybe 10% over the cost of renewable energy, and that would make Puerto Rico very competitive in energy rather than being one of the highest energy costs. So that would have been the right way, and I would have hoped if this were up to Puerto Rico to do on its own, that's what it would have been done. But it wasn't up to its own. It was done by a control board controlled by Washington, and I think they made some very bad mistakes. Now, we have to admit that Puerto Rico has not always taken full advantage of the policy space that they have available. And one of the things we talked about this morning, last night, was, for instance, in the public sector, a decrease in the number of public employees, but an increasing reliance on consultants. And you might say, why do you do that? Well, this actually goes on in Washington too. They like head counts. For some, they like to feel like I'm really doing a good job on the head count, and nobody notices the fact that the indirect head count, the hidden one, is going up. But the negative effect, and significantly negative, is it undermines state capacity, because the learning that goes on is learning that goes on in McKinsey or whatever the consulting firm. And any of you who've read there are 2 or 3 books written in the last year or two about why you shouldn't rely on McKinsey. Well, I won't go into but they're very entertaining books, which I recommend to you, and I recommend to the Puerto Rican government when they're thinking about using consultants rather than developing their own state capacity. Well, in the last few minutes, I just want to say a few words about both why this is a particularly good moment going forward for thinking about this issue of growth strategy, why there are some things that, obviously I can't describe the particular things that ought to be done, but there are some reasons for optimism. And then, as an economist, we have a dismal science. I have to end on why things may be far worse than they are today. So on the positive side, I've been advocating the use of industrial policy for a long time, using it in a very broad way, because industry is not, well, I don't mean just industry, I mean service sector, agriculture, there is high value added agriculture. It's intervening in the structure of the economy, the choice of technique, thinking about how you go about learning. It's active participation. It's not directing. It's not a a controlled economy, but it's intervening in subtle ways to recognizing that the private sector doesn't necessarily guide the economy in the ways that are socially optimal. So industrial policy broadly understood in this way used to be verboten. It was something that you couldn't talk about. Now even the United States is doing it. And we passed two important industrial policy bills in the last year, the CHIPS Act and the IRA Act. The second thing is the new global geopolitics has increased an awareness of the importance of nearshoring and friendshoring and onshoring. And that means locating manufacturing supply sources in Puerto Rico or someplace else that is near to the United States is very important. And at the current juncture, there's no place with greater political certainty than Puerto Rico. You know, any of the other countries, even when things are going well, you know that they, on a turn of a dime, they may not go so well. So anybody concerned about security would naturally think about Puerto Rico. And obviously there are issues about how do you implement, how should the US government implement that kind of policy. Going forward, one has the rebuilding as a result of the disasters has provided an opportunity for new infrastructure, a new power grid that could be more adapted to climate change. These are there are many opportunities for mobilizing remittances more effectively. Actually, I think there are lots of untapped opportunities that Puerto Rico has to enhance its economic growth. But I have to end on a warning that as bad as things are and the fact that growth has been negative, it stabilized in the last couple of years. It stabilized in the last couple of years mainly because of the injection of funds related to the disasters. And when one looks at that, remember that these numbers are gross national product or gross domestic product. And it's the word gross there that we often forget about. What does that gross mean? That we don't take into account depreciation or destruction. And what economists really want to look at is net domestic product and net, and that is taking out of what you've added what's been destroyed. And if you looked at net domestic product, you would take into account the fact that there's been an enormous destruction as a result of the natural disasters in the last 5 years. And that means the numbers that we ought to be showing are much worse than the bad numbers that we've been looking at. So one shouldn't have complacency over the fact that the numbers have the gross numbers have stabilized. The net numbers are really just repairing. They reflect the repairing of the damage that was done. There are other challenges that all developing countries are going to be facing. One of them is AI. The effect, I think, of AI and robotization is that it will almost surely lower the asset value of unskilled labor. And that is one of the assets that is strong in Puerto Rico. So that will make the challenge of development all the greater. In the near term, there are two things that have came up in the discussion this morning. I'll just mention them very briefly. The fact that monetary policy is tighter is going to make it access to credit more difficult. And the disturbances in Silicon Valley and the other regulatory problems, which I think are probably worse than just those two institutions' problems indicate, mean that there will be greater tightness in credit markets. And when you have that tightness, those who are viewed as more risky get cut out or face higher interest rates more dramatically. So that will make it more difficult for Puerto Rico to leave being under the control of PROMESA. Your independence, your limited independence will be put off in time. And the final thing is the high levels of borrowing associated with COVID-19 and the political gridlock in the United States mean that it is likely that the U.S. will continue to have will face a period of fiscal stringency in which issues which are not politically central will find it difficult getting funding. And that means I think Puerto Rico will have a harder time getting the funding that it needs in order to including kinds of tax subsidies or other programs that might enhance a growth strategy along the lines that I indicated. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations for organizing this workshop. We had a very enriching morning of discussions that I think are pertinent and necessary for Puerto Rico. And thank you, Horacio, Raquel, and Joe for the excellent presentations. My task is to comment on Joe's presentation. So what I'm going to do is to give you my view of what's going on, and I will what's going on in the economy of Puerto Rico, and I will refer to three aspects or three blocks of what Joe emphasized in his presentation, which are probably the three most important building blocks of the strategy of the Oversight Board to address Puerto Rico's economic and out-migration crisis. The first one is the fiscal policy. The second is the strategy for economic growth. And the third one is the debt restructuring. Fiscal policy, what the Oversight Board has done is to design and implement a path that includes measures both at the spending level and at the revenues level, in order to converge to a value of the primary fiscal surplus that would allow the debt to GNP ratio to remain at stable values, and in that way to guarantee that debt is sustainable. The second part, the structural reforms, we'll see refers to reforms that are supposed to lead to increases in GNP growth in the medium and the long term. And the third one is the public debt restructuring that includes different pieces and that it will have implications for the near future in Puerto Rico. So let me show you some data in this respect. So Joe was referring to certain characteristics of fiscal policy that are concerning for the future of Puerto Rico, and there were basically two parts that he referred to. The first one has to do with the role that the state can play and the capacity of the state in general. And what we've been seeing, it's a peculiar dynamic. This is not that easy even for countries that pursue fiscal austerity in times of recessions to find, which is that the central government spending on payroll decreased massively, but that's not the end of the story. What we see at the same time is a significant increase in government spending on professional services. This is consultancy, mostly McKinsey, which illustrate what's going on at the level of the state and how the state works. And the effects of these are hardly neutral. At the same time, what we see is a declining trend, both for the spending on education as percent of GNP, K-12, and this is the University of Puerto Rico. You see that since PROMESA was enacted, the spending on the appropriations to the University of Puerto Rico went down from about $930 million to close to 500 million, and the board is planning that they will stay flat at 500, which in a context of inflation means a reduction in real spending. The three presentations that we had before, in one way or another, emphasize the importance of education and learning for economic development. So this is an issue we need to pay attention to. The second big block is the impact of structural reforms. So I was actually very impressed by the discussion that we had in the workshop this morning, in which I asked experts on the issue of industrial policies, manufacturing on Puerto Rico, about their views on the impact of these structural reforms on the productive capacity of Puerto Rico. And no one is really looking at this because it's as if they are just words in the view of many. They mean really nothing. So what's the point of studying or assessing what impact they will have on GNP growth? Maybe you know someone who's actually doing some work on the effects that structural reforms could have on GNP growth. But the board had defined 5 structural reforms: a human capital and labor, a K-12 education reform, ease of doing business, power sector, and infrastructure reforms. And initially, the forecast or the projection was that the entire recovery, the entire growth of Puerto Rico's economy was going to be explained by these reforms. So just like we all know what was going on before before COVID and before PROMESA, the economy was in a deep economic and out-migration crisis. Population was declining, increasing actually the debt burden in relation to the population, and we were experiencing a situation of fiscal austerity that was leading to even more contractions in the aggregate demand in a context in which the aggregate demand was already falling, contributing to the destabilizing dynamics. But the projection was that these reforms will have very significant effects on economic growth. And what you see here is an exercise that's actually quite common in countries that go through debt restructurings. What you see in debt restructurings typically is you need a GDP or GNP projection for a relatively long horizon to assess what's the debt that can be sustained by this economy without destabilizing it. The higher the economic growth of the economy, the more debt can be sustained. And particularly if there is higher economic growth, there are more tax revenues, and you can pay more debt. And the higher the interest rate at which debts need to be refinanced, the lower the stock of debt that can be sustained. What we typically see, this is clear evidence, especially since the end of the Bretton Woods system, which led to a new era of sovereign debt crisis, instability, and restructurings, we see that countries that are in situations of debt distress, typically they get a debt sustainability analysis by the IMF that is over-optimistic about the growth of the economy, and the implication of that is that you can pay more. Well, look at Puerto Rico. First fiscal plan, 2018, April. This is the projection for the effects of the structural reforms on cumulative GNP growth. Next fiscal plan, June, okay, correction. The next one, when is that one? 2019, oh no, I'm missing this one, in October. Again, another correction. 2019, we see that nothing is happening, and then the projections are corrected again. And year after year, we get a new correction, and nothing is happening. The board now is blaming the government. But when you make assumptions, you have to not only think about what the effects would be in theory, but also what's the capacity for the implementation of the policies that you are pursuing. In any case, at the moment in which this first fiscal plan in 2018 was published and we saw the effects of these structural reforms, there were significant discrepancies among analysts, experts on the effects that they would have with respect to the views of the board. But this is what we're seeing on this front. Let me go now to the third part, which is the debt restructuring. What you see here is the difference between the debt service on the COFINA and the general obligation bonds pre-restructuring, the red line, and after the restructuring. And the difference is significant, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That's not the end. It's not just what the difference is, but what can be sustained. Puerto Rico is paying interest and capital, it's amortizing capital. Any debt restructuring is done in a context of uncertainty, and Puerto Rico was hit by a series of shocks of enormous magnitude, probably more than any other country in the world, because on top of COVID and the war in Ukraine, Puerto Rico had the hurricanes and the earthquake. Okay? So of course, all debt policies and fiscal policies need to get recalibrated over time when you get hit by shocks of that size. Joe mentioned something very important, which is not in this figure, the PREPA restructuring. Electricity, or energy in general, is a key cost in any economy. So a restructuring that doesn't resolve the problem and leaves a debt overhang means that there will be a financial cost that will be added to the cost of energy, and that makes the entire economy less competitive. And you see, it's not it becomes less competitive for a reason that is not real, but financial. So it's also important to pay attention to what's going on with PREPA. In the current global environment, we have, on the one hand, higher inflation than what was anticipated at the time in which the debt restructuring was done. And that means that the real interest payments that Puerto Rico is paying now are lower because you have the nominal, when your debt is not indexed, if you have more inflation, then the real burden is lower. But at the same time, Puerto Rico will need to reaccess credit markets to refinance those debts. If it could not refinance those debts, it will have to generate more surpluses, more fiscal surpluses in order to be able to repay that debt. And that would entail further austerity, but actually it might never get there because of the effects that could have, as we saw in the previous decade, on the economic activity, and therefore on tax revenues, and therefore on the primary fiscal balance, which is what we economists call an endogenous outcome. Okay? Now we're in a different global context in which not only there is higher inflation, but also the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the central banks from advanced economies are responding to this inflationary environment by increasing interest rates. And not only that, but they are also doing quantitative tightening. So every day, the Fed trading desk and the ECB trading desk are selling the bonds that they had bought in the previous decade, meaning that they are just taking dollars or euros out of the economy, there is less liquidity in the economy. And when there is less liquidity in the economy, its cost is higher. It's more difficult to roll over the debts. So this will be an important issue for Puerto Rico in the near future. Let me conclude with some final comments. I see the board's strategy for economic growth as a risky bet, but a risky bet with big downside. Why? Because on the one hand, we know that the losses from cutting investments in knowledge, are well established. We know that if you cut investment in knowledge, it's likely that medium-term growth is going to suffer. On the other hand, the gains from these structural reforms are more dubious and probably unlikely to materialize. So the debt restructuring gives some time, but not much. As Joe explained, the reason why today we are not seeing a fall in real GNP is because of the injection of federal funds, the disaster funds, the reconstruction funds. So that has a multiplier, even if lower than it would happen if Puerto Rico could get directly more of that, or Puerto Rican companies could be the ones actually doing all of the work that is done with those funds. There is a multiplier, and that's what helps the economy today not to continue falling and actually grow a little bit. But what will happen when those reconstruction funds are not there anymore? What the economy needs is right now to be doing the policies that will unleash medium-term economic growth. So that's why I conclude with this message that a comprehensive strategy for economic growth remains as the most urgent and important challenge for Puerto Rico. So in this sense, the work of the Center for the New Economy continues being extremely important, and we look forward to helping in that regard. Thank you.
We should do at least one or two questions before they take off. So I have, well, you guys take a while. I wanted to ask you about the already we spent enough time on the gender gap issue that you presented, and I was wondering is there a little more depth to the reasoning behind why those gaps are occurring in the way that they are?
The gender gap in test scores or in employment or?
Employment ones. And well, the test scores were actually very interesting
Okay, I mean,
as well, because I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, the gender gaps in labor force participation, as you know, have historically been there. A lot of it is thought to be social norms. Now, people argue about the importance of social norms, or I call it culture, relative to, the availability of technological innovations that came, say, in the 1940s or 1950s with washing machines and refrigerators and frozen meals, and the fact that you can make meals really quickly rather than spend, 3 or 4 hours. But there's also policy variables such as the availability of childcare, and how expensive it is, and what's the quality of that childcare, who can avail themselves of it. But even given all those things, the idea of what's the right thing for a woman to do, and that large decrease in labor force participation that you see once they have a child, it's not all childcare. It's also a lot of, what's the correlation between that and social norms? I think social norms also have a lot to do with, or aspirations, which are governed a lot by social norms, to do with these shrinking gaps that we see in math. But I think that the people who really are at risk here are also very much the boys. I mean, boys are not doing well in a variety of outcomes. And we see that very clearly in the United States, but we see it the fact that the vocabulary gap, the reading gap for boys and girls remains extremely large, and it's shrinking much more slowly.
Thank you. Joanna.
Thank you, everybody, for incredible remarks. I think the point about investing in education was really well taken. One thing I wonder, though, is in terms of Puerto Rico, particularly compared to Latin America, the ease of migration is greater in Puerto Rico. And so I wonder if there has to be something in addition to investment in education or something that's coupled to. I mean, to me, it makes sense for labor and industry policies to go with it, but it doesn't seem like we've cracked that in Puerto Rico. What would you recommend in terms of policies to take advantage of investments in education? Hopefully they'll come.
Well, one of the, I mean, there is one of the Caribbean islands has invested a lot in education for nursing, and they all leave the island to come to the United States to provide us with nurses. That's not the model that you want. And so the question is, and that's where industrial policy becomes important. You want to create jobs that are linked with, marry the education with jobs so that they have reasons to stay in Puerto Rico. And so that's where, you know, Martin's last slide talked about a comprehensive strategy, one that really has some sense of let's have an education system and a framework for what kinds of jobs. You know, it's not government saying we're going to create this number of jobs of this type, but thinking about what are some of the sectors that we can help grow by a variety of indirect means, and having the people that would be able to man those sectors and women those sectors.
Thank you so much for this presentation. As a non-economist in the room, it seems to me that economic solutions for Puerto Rico are inextricably linked to the question of status. And I'm wondering if you can briefly comment on the status question and whether or not you think that Puerto Rico will be able to dig itself out of the hole it's in without a status change.
Who wants to take that one?
A little softball for you.
Martin, well, yeah, I think, you know, what I said in my remarks were that there were big advantages and disadvantages, and you know, it's so clear that Puerto Rico is very divided on this, and divided in a way that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and so if you think that a changing status needs to have a strong majority, it's very hard to figure out, you know, to get that kind of consensus that will be important in the next stage. So I think that political problem is really an impediment to a changing status, and that's, you know, makes it more likely the status quo will continue. But sentiment does change, and we've seen large changes in the sentiment. I haven't seen a very careful calculation of the cost and the benefits, you know, that I delineated. But even if you did that, that's almost surely going to be static, and you can't really fully assess, for instance, the dynamic benefits that would come from, you know, the possible unleashing of a spirit of being an independent country. You know, so as an example, or the new opportunities that might be opened up as being a state that people would say, oh yes, you know, this is just like in any other state. It's no worse than, it's no different than investing in Mississippi, you know, with all the problems that might be attendant to that. So I think what I've noticed is that there is an age difference in attitudes. And in my view on voting, I would give more weight to younger people because they're going to live under any status longer. So I think if you had a weighted voting by the number of years that you're going to live in expected value, I think Puerto Rico would probably go strongly towards independence.
Can I add something to that comment, which is just kind of oblique, but it's, you know, I think there's something to learn from the experience of the southern countries that joined the EU and what the large investment made by their richer countries in the EU. I'm talking about investments early on, I'm not talking about 2008, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, that helped make these countries much wealthier and made the EU much more popular. So this is not to say whether this is good or not, but it might be very helpful towards thinking about Puerto Rico as a much poorer state.
Yeah, and I just add one more thing. It's not only the investments. A lot of them think that the institutional, you know, the change in culture and change in institutional frameworks was very useful. And then in terms of, you know, people cite these two that look at Barbados, and the other one is they look at Jamaica. And so you get experiences in both ways. So I think it's not dispositive which way things go, but I think what Raquel pointed out is an important point.
Hi, thank you again for wonderful presentation, and thank you to my husband for helping organizing it. So I'm from Puerto Rico, and I'm always curious about what kind of data we have out there, because, you know, we're not a country like the rest of Latin America, and we're not a state as part of the U.S. So I worry that we often are excluded from the studies in the academia, and these studies are crucial to guide policies and inform policymakers. So from your experience so far in the literature concerning Latin America or Puerto Rico or the US, or all above, where Puerto Rico, do we see a gap in the research done specifically in Puerto Rico because of these, you know, particularity, and what can we do to fill that gap?
Yeah, just over lunch we were having more or less this discussion with Gustavo Bobones, and there are, I didn't know this, but there are huge gaps in what kind of data are available for Puerto Rico, and I think there is a big need to fill that gap, because lots of the understanding that we can hope to have has to be based on evidence and running in surveys. In this sense, I think that your center could take leadership in promoting surveys, whatever is missing, to get to a better understanding and design on policies. It's a very important point.
Well, I just can add one minor comment. I think there is more that can be done at the domestic level as well in terms of data availability. We look at the fiscal data closely. Many countries in the world, in many countries in the world, the first day of the month, you already have the information of the tax revenues from the previous month. And by half of the month, you have the data on spending. So you have the entire fiscal data within a few days, and that you don't have in Puerto Rico. So, and this is, you're going through complex issues, important moments for the future of Puerto Rico, in which having more timely data will help. But again, there are domestic changes to the legislation, to the normative frameworks that could help in this sense.
I visited Puerto Rico over spring break, and one thing I learned is that the government has been like implementing these generous tax incentives to try and like attract these tycoons and influencers to buy up cheap property there. And I was wondering, do you think that's like an effective like approach to growth, and is it sustainable?
Yeah, no, I think, do you want to say?
No, I mean, I recommend you to watch the Bug Bunny video on YouTube about this issue. Yeah, right? What's the name, Deepak? El Apagón. El Apagón. Check it out. Okay, it's a nice song, and then it turns into a documentary.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of a bad industrial policy that has mainly negative effects and doesn't really, you know, you have to think about, when I was saying before, Puerto Rico has some to blame for itself for adopting not the wisest policies. And this is an example of one of the policies that was not, you know, it was intended to attract money that it hoped would lead to people who would invest in the island, and the real effects have been negligible, and the adverse effect on property values have been significant. But if you want a good conversation about Bitcoins, you can just go to a hotel, a restaurant, and you can hear some of these guys talking about Bitcoin. So if you want to get a tip, it might be valuable.
Thank you for your presentations. It is pretty clear that cutting education spending, it has negative long-term effects. But it is a bankruptcy, so I was wondering, where could the government have achieved savings, or is your answer that it should have been more of a restructuring process with lower debt payments?
So any restructuring process is a political process. It's a power dispute because there are distributional consequences. There are also efficiency consequences. If you have a burden of debt that is unsustainable, that is going to affect the dynamic of the economy. It will actually lead to a deeper recession, more unemployment. But the distributional aspect is important. So when you hear about you know, the FOMB being a set of technical appointees, that's just like, it just doesn't make any sense. It's not the way it works. And the assumptions on which the debt sustainability analysis, which is an important element for the debt restructuring, is built, are generally not assumptions that were that were chosen in a non-arbitrary way. It's what typically happens is that first you know what's the amount of debt relief that you will provide, and then you pick the assumptions such that your model tells you that this is the debt that can be sustained. And that's what happens almost everywhere, unfortunately, in the way the IMF has been part of this problem for sovereign nations. There are cases in which we saw different dynamics, but those are the exception. My view of what I saw with Puerto Rico and the political dynamic is of the first kind, meaning that you first know what you want to do, regardless of whether that's going to be sustainable or not, and then you pick the assumptions. In any case, as I explained, you know, there's massive uncertainty, and we had all these shocks. And one of those shocks actually plays in favor, which is higher inflation means a lower real debt burden. But if a country has no financing, you have no alternative than to accommodate your policies to the budget constraints you face. That's it. But then the issue is how you spend what you can spend, including what's the amount of your resources that is devoted to debt payments. So those are two related discussions. We will see soon whether that can be sustained or not. and at the same time, it's important for the purposes of economic growth to rationalize the use of resources that the state has. And when we see these cuts in investments in knowledge, well, clearly there is a motive to be worried. Okay.
So let me just add one couple. I mentioned before Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. So bankruptcy codes tell when a debtor can't pay everything that he owes, who gets paid and who doesn't get paid. And the reason there's a special provision of the bankruptcy code for public entities is that the creditors, people that are owed, are not clear. So for instance, you may have made Social Security contributions for retirement, but you don't have a contract, but it's an implied contract. There's an understanding, the government said you're going to get so much money. It may or may not be written down. There was a law, so there's a framework. So Chapter 9 recognizes that public entities have formal creditors, like the money that's been borrowed from Goldman, but it also has a large number of other kinds of claimants, retirees, schools, students. These are all social obligations that are as important as the contractual, or more important than the contractual obligations to the creditors, to the formal creditors. So if this, this is where the power dynamics would have come in. It is more likely, I think, if it had been done under Chapter 9, they would have said, education, you can't take a cut like that. And if you have preserved educational more, they would have said, is there anything else to cut? There really probably wasn't very much. You say everybody, gives a lecture about being more efficient, but and they would have forced the financial creditors to take a bigger haircut. So that's what would have happened if if Puerto Rico had Chapter 9.
Great. Raquel, Horacio, Joe, Martin, we're very grateful. Thank you very much for your time. Thank all of you guys for coming, the folks from CNE, from the Economic Growth Center, from the Tobin Center, and from RITM, and from the other universities that joined us today. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you guys again soon.